What if I told you that Jesus answered the succession question directly? Not in a parable, not in a symbol, not in a metaphor that later theologians spent centuries arguing over. He answered it face to face, in plain language, when his disciples came to him and said, "We know you are leaving. We know you are departing from us. So who will be great over us after you are gone?" And he told them. That answer was buried in the Egyptian desert for 600 years. The document that preserved it was fought, condemned, and suppressed for centuries before someone finally sealed it into a clay jar at the base of a cliff in Upper Egypt. And the name Jesus gave in that answer, the specific name, the name of a person, a real historical person who appears in Paul's letters and in the book of Acts and in the records of the first-century historian Josephus, was not the name the institution built its entire authority on. It was not Peter. You have heard the story of Peter so many times it has become invisible. You know it the way you know the alphabet. Jesus is standing in the district of Caesarea Philippi. Simon speaks up. He says, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus responds. According to Matthew 16:18, Jesus says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overcome it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven." Stop there, because that sentence has carried more institutional weight than any other sentence in the history of the Western world. Every Catholic pope since the 1st century, every single one of them, traces his authority to Matthew 16-18. Every bishop in the Catholic tradition, every priest who administers sacraments, every theologian who speaks with the voice of institutional Christianity, all of it begins with this sentence. The papacy is built on it. Apostolic succession is built on it. The idea that there exists a human chain of authority, running unbroken from the 12 apostles through every ordained bishop to every ordained priest, representing the only legitimate pathway between the believer and the divine, is built on it. The entire hierarchical structure that told you who speaks for God and who must sit quietly and receive has its foundation in one conversation, one sentence, one rock, one man, and that man is Peter. Everything flows from Peter. Everything the institutional church built for 2,000 years flows from Matthew 16:18. That is the story you were given, and for most of history it was the only story available. Now hold that sentence in your mind and ask yourself something the institution has never encouraged you to ask. Ask yourself, did Jesus have only one conversation about who leads this movement after he is gone? Because if the answer is yes, then Matthew 16:18 settles everything. But if the answer is no, if there was another conversation recorded in a document that was in circulation among Christian communities in the 1st and 2nd centuries, then the question of succession has not been settled at all. It has been decided for you by the men who chose which texts you were allowed to read and which texts needed to disappear. But here is what's fascinating. There is another document. A gospel, not a medieval invention, not a fringe text assembled centuries after the fact by enemies of the church. A gospel whose fragments were discovered in the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city called Oxyrhynchus by British archaeologists in 1897 and again in 1903. Those fragments were dated to approximately 200 AD. They sat in catalogued boxes for nearly 50 years because nobody could identify what they had come from. And then in December 1945, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman, digging for fertilizer at the base of a cliff in Upper Egypt, struck a sealed earthenware jar with his mattock. Inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus codices, and in one of them, Nag Hammadi Codex Thought-provoking, was the complete text of what those fragments had belonged to. 114 sayings of Jesus. No birth story, no crucifixion narrative, no resurrection account, just the words, Jesus said. And then the saying. And in the 12th saying number 12 of 114, the disciples ask Jesus the question they had been carrying. They say, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is it who will be great over us?" And Jesus answers them. That answer is what the institution spent 1,600 years ensuring you would never read. Not because it was false, but because it was true. The Gospel of Thomas was already being condemned around 180 AD by Irenaeus of Lyon, the most important heresiological writer of the 2nd century. He knew the text. He named it. He catalogued it as a document being used by communities he intended to suppress. And 170 years after Irenaeus, Athanasius of Alexandria issued the letter that defined the 27-book New Testament canon you hold today, and the Gospel of Thomas was not in it. The monks who had been preserving it buried it in a jar in the desert rather than burn it. And there it stayed, through the collapse of Rome, through the Crusades, through the Reformation, through the Enlightenment. 16 centuries of institutional silence. What you are about to discover will not require you to choose between faith and history. It is going to do something more difficult than that. It is going to show you that the canonical New Testament itself, in letters written by Paul decades before the Gospels were composed, in the book of Acts, in the documented history of who actually led the Jesus movement after the crucifixion, quietly confirms the historical reality of what the Gospel of Thomas records. The institution did not suppress an invention. It suppressed a competing truth, and the question of which truth won, and why, and what was lost when it did, is what we are going to trace together. If you have ever sat in a pew and felt that something essential was missing from the story you were given, if you ever felt the hierarchy of authority descending from Peter was not quite as settled as you were told, if you ever sensed that the question of who actually leads had been answered somewhere you were never allowed to look, you were not wrong. You were sensing the gap, and the gap has a name, and the name is in a gospel that spent 600 years sealed under Egyptian sand, and now it is in your hands, because you are watching this now for a reason. Tell me in the comments before we go any further, who do you think Jesus would have chosen to lead after him? I am fascinated to know how much true seekers of truth like you already sense. Your answer can illuminate others who are only now awakening to what was hidden, because the name is coming, and when you hear it in the words of the text itself, you will understand exactly why those words spent 16 centuries sealed in a jar. December 1945, the Jabal al-Tarif Cliff, Upper Egypt. 11 kilometers northeast of the town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer named Muhammad Ali al-Saman was digging with his brothers near the base of a cliff. They were looking for sabak, a natural fertilizer found in the soil of the Nile Valley. It was the kind of work farmers had been doing in that region for centuries. And then Muhammad Ali's mattock struck something hard beneath the surface. He expected a stone. What he found was a sealed earthenware jar, approximately 1 meter tall, its top intact, its contents undisturbed. He hesitated. Local tradition held that jars buried in the earth sometimes contained spirits. But there was also the possibility of gold. The possibility of gold won. He broke the jar open. Inside were 13 leather-bound papyrus codices. Not gold. Books, ancient books. Muhammad Ali gathered them, realized they were not what he had hoped for. and brought them home. His mother used some of the loose pages as kindling for the fire. She did not know what they were. Nobody in that household knew what they were. They were old paper covered in a script none of them could read. And so some of them burned. The rest made their way, slowly and through considerable difficulty, through Egyptian antique dealers, through border crossings, through scholarly disputes and legal battles, until most of them arrived at the Coptic Museum in Cairo, where they can be examined today. 13 codices, 52 separate tractates written in Sahidic Coptic, translated from Greek originals, the Nag Hammadi Library, and inside it, in Nag Hammadi Codex II, the second tractate, the text that had already driven one of the most powerful institutions in human history to centuries of active suppression, the Gospel of Thomas. Now here is the first thing you need to understand about what this text actually is. It does not present itself as a narrative. It does not tell the story of Jesus' birth, ministry, death, or resurrection. There is no plot. There are no miracles described in sequence. There is no geography, no chronology, no characters moving through scenes and confrontations. There is only this: 114 sayings of Jesus, each one introduced by the same 2 words. Jesus said. And then the saying. And the very first saying announces what this document believes about itself. Logion 1. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Not wisdom, not comfort, not moral guidance for a better life. Whoever interprets these sayings correctly will not die. The text presents itself as a key to immortality, and it presents that key as hidden. The word the prologue uses to describe the sayings is not teachings or instructions or revelations. It is secret. According to the opening of the Gospel of Thomas, as preserved in Nag Hammadi Codex II, the text begins, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke and Didymos Judas Thomas recorded." Secret sayings. That is not a rhetorical flourish. That is the document's own description of its nature. These were not written for public reading in a church service. They were not compiled to be heard by a congregation and explained by a priest. They were recorded by Thomas and preserved for those capable of finding their interpretation. And the institution that built itself on Peter's public confession at Caesarea Philippi had no interest in a gospel that opened by announcing its contents were secret. But here is what's crucial. What was found at Nag Hammadi in 1945 was not the original Gospel of Thomas. It was a Coptic translation of a Greek original, copied by a scribe in the mid to late 4th century. And here is why that matters. Because the original Greek text had already been discovered, decades before 1945, by archaeologists who had no idea what they were holding. In January 1897, 2 British scholars, Bernard Grenfell and Arthur Hunt of Queen's College, Oxford, began excavating the ruins of an ancient Egyptian city called Oxyrhynchus, approximately 160 kilometers southwest of Cairo. The city's desert climate had preserved papyrus fragments in remarkable condition. Over the course of their excavations in 1897 and again in 1903, Grenfell and Hunt recovered 3 papyrus fragments containing Greek sayings of Jesus. They catalogued them as P-oxy, 1. P-oxy, 654, and P-oxy, 655. The fragments were dated to approximately 200 AD. They were published, they were studied, and nobody, for nearly 50 years, could identify what larger text they had come from. They were filed. They waited. Not until December 1945 did the connection become possible. When the Coptic Gospel of Thomas was found at Nag Hammadi and eventually translated, scholars recognized the Oxyrhynchus sayings immediately. The Greek fragments were portions of the same text. This means the Gospel of Thomas was not a document sealed into one jar in one location in the 4th century. It was circulating in Greek in Egypt at least as early as 200 AD. It existed. It was being read. It was being copied. And it had been in existence long enough to generate manuscript fragments in 2 completely different ancient cities. This is not a document invented in the Middle Ages. This is not a forgery assembled by enemies of the Church. This is a text with a documented manuscript history stretching back nearly 1,800 years, according to James M. Robinson of Claremont Graduate University, the general editor of the first complete English translation of the Nag Hammadi texts, published in 1977, and according to Thomas O. Lambdin, whose 1959 translation of the Gospel of Thomas became the scholarly standard, the text that emerged from that clay jar in December 1945, represents a tradition that was being actively circulated and actively suppressed in the earliest centuries of the Christian movement. Actively circulated, actively suppressed, at the same time. Because the church that was building itself on Peter already knew this gospel existed. The question was not whether this text was real. The question was what to do about the fact that it was. Around 180 AD, nearly 2 centuries before Athanasius of Alexandria issued the letter that fixed the New Testament canon as you know it today, Irenaeus of Lyon was writing the most comprehensive anti-heresy document of the 2nd century, 5 volumes, systematic, thorough. And in the first volume, in his catalogue of texts being used by communities he intended to suppress, Irenaeus named the Gospel of Thomas. He cited a specific passage from it. He knew what it said. He had read it. He catalogued the communities using it as groups to be eliminated. The followers of a Gnostic teacher named Marcus were among those he identified. That was not 1945. That was 180 AD, which means the war over this text had been going on for more than 700 years before Muhammad Ali al-Saman broke a jar open in the desert. The suppression did not begin with Athanasius. It did not begin with the monks burying the codices. It began with Irenaeus in the 2nd century, before the canon was settled, before the institutional church had fully consolidated its authority, and it began because of a specific saying, not one of the mystical sayings about light and darkness, not one of the difficult sayings scholars have spent decades arguing over, a simple, direct answer to a simple, direct question. Saying number 12. The disciples asked who would lead the movement after Jesus was gone, and Jesus gave them a name. The name is the reason the institution needed this gospel in the ground. Saying number 12. Here is what the disciples asked. Here is the question that could not be delayed, that every one of them had been carrying since the moment they understood Jesus was leaving. They came to him, and they said it plainly. We know that you will depart from us. Who is it who will be great over us? And Jesus answered them, Wherever you have come from, you are to go to James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. That is the entirety of Logion 12. The disciples asked a direct question. Jesus gave a direct answer, and the answer is James, not Peter, not John, not Matthew. James. Now understand what this means. For 2,000 years, the institutional answer to the succession question has been a sentence from Matthew 16. You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. But in the Gospel of Thomas, when the disciples ask the succession question directly and explicitly, Jesus gives a different answer. He does not say, stay with Peter. He does not say, Peter will lead you. He says, go to James. And here is where the story gets disturbing. This is not a case of the Gospel of Thomas contradicting the canonical record. This is a case of it agreeing with the canonical record in ways the institution hoped you would never notice. It is the agreement, not the contradiction, that the institution feared. Let us start with the obvious problem. James was not one of the 12. Search every list of the 12 apostles in the canonical New Testament. Matthew 10:2-4, Mark 3:16-19, Luke 6:13-16, Acts 1-13. The same 12 names appear in each list, and James, the brother of Jesus, is not among them. The institutional church built its hierarchy on the authority of the 12. Apostolic succession, the chain of authority running from Jesus through the 12, through every bishop to every priest, is built on the 12. And the man Jesus designated in the Gospel of Thomas to lead his movement was not in that group. That is the institutional problem with Logion 12. Not that it names a person, but that it names someone the hierarchy could not absorb without collapsing. But here is what's fascinating. Paul of Tarsus, writing his letter to the churches of Galatia approximately 50 years before the Gospel of Matthew was composed, calls James an apostle. Not a disciple, an apostle. In Galatians 1:19, writing in the first person as a direct eyewitness, Paul says, "I saw none of the other apostles, only James, the Lord's brother." Paul traveled to Jerusalem specifically to meet the leaders of the movement. He met Peter. And the only other person he called an apostle from that visit was James. Not John, not Matthew, James. Paul wrote before the Gospels. Paul wrote from personal, first-hand knowledge of who actually led the movement. And in his account, James stands beside Peter in the apostolic category. But that is only the beginning. In his first letter to the Corinthian church, dated by scholars to approximately 53-54 AD, Paul lists the resurrection appearances of Jesus in sequence. He records who the risen Christ appeared to, and in what order. According to 1 Corinthians 15:7, the risen Jesus appeared to James before appearing to all the apostles as a group. A private appearance, specifically to James, before the collective commissioning of anyone else. This is Paul, writing at least 25 years before the Gospel of Matthew was composed, recording that the risen Jesus chose to appear to James privately before appearing to the wider group. The institution did not build its theology around that moment, but Paul preserved it, and it is there. Now here is what happens when you lay Logion 12 against the record of what actually occurred in the Jerusalem church. Around 49 AD, the most divisive theological question of the first generation of Christians came to a head. Were Gentile believers required to follow Jewish law? It was a question that could fracture the entire movement. And so the leaders gathered in Jerusalem. Peter spoke, Paul and Barnabas spoke, and then James spoke. According to Acts 15:13, Luke records the moment. After them James spoke up, "Brothers, listen to me." And what James said was the verdict. He issued the apostolic decree. He rendered the ruling. He brought the council to its conclusion. Peter was present. Peter had spoken, but it was James who decided. But here comes the most disturbing part. Paul tells us in his letter to the Galatians, as a direct eyewitness, that Peter was in Antioch, eating with Gentile believers. And then something stopped him. A delegation arrived, men sent from James, and Peter, the man Jesus called the Rock, the man given the keys of the kingdom of heaven, withdrew. He drew back. He separated himself. Paul's exact words. Before certain men came from James, he was eating with the Gentiles. But when they came, he drew back and separated himself, fearing the circumcision group. Peter was afraid of the men James sent. That is not the behavior of the head of a hierarchy. That is the behavior of a regional representative receiving instructions from the actual center of power. The rock of the church deferred to the authority of James at a distance. James did not have to be present. His name was enough to change Peter's behavior. That is not the conduct of a secondary figure. That is the conduct of the person who actually held the authority. Now come to 62 AD. The high priest Ananus had just taken office. The Roman governor Festus had died. His replacement was still traveling to his post. There was a brief window without Roman oversight, and Ananus used it. According to Josephus, the Jewish Roman historian writing in his Antiquities of the Jews completed around 93 AD, Ananus convened the Sanhedrin and brought before it, in Josephus's own words, the brother of Jesus who was called Christ, whose name was James, and certain others. He accused them of transgressing the law. He delivered them to be stoned. James the Just was executed. This is one of the most historically verified facts connected to any figure from the early Jesus movement. Secular historians accept it, and what follows the execution is just as telling as the execution itself. Josephus records that the citizens of Jerusalem were so outraged that they petitioned King Agrippa, who removed Ananus from the high priesthood as punishment. A city mourning, a high priest deposed. Because the man who was killed mattered, that is the measure of James the Just, and Eusebius of Caesarea, writing his ecclesiastical history in the early 4th century, preserved the account of the 2nd century historian Hegesippus, whose original writings are otherwise lost to us. Hegesippus described James in terms that make his stature impossible to misread. He called him the Just. He recorded that James had knees hard as a camel's from constant prayer. He recorded that James alone was permitted to enter the Holy of Holies, and Eusebius quoted Clement of Alexandria directly. James the Just was made the first bishop of Jerusalem by the Lord, Peter, James, and John. The first bishop of Jerusalem, named by Jesus, ratified by Peter, James the son of Zebedee, and John. According to the scholar Albert Hogeterp, whose work examined the relationship between the Gospel of Thomas and Paul's account of the Jerusalem church, Logion 12 may reflect a tradition that predates the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Because the designation of James the Just in Logion 12 agrees precisely with the picture Paul draws in Galatians 2. The same leader, the same authority structure, the same deference from Peter. The Gospel of Thomas may be preserving what the earliest movement knew about who Jesus named, before Peter's tradition won the institutional war. The Gospel of Thomas says, "Go to James." Paul's letters show James as the authority Peter deferred to. Acts 15 shows James rendering the final verdict of the first great council. Josephus records a city in mourning when James is killed. Eusebius records him as the first bishop of Jerusalem. Every independent source points to the same conclusion. The documents agree. What they do not agree on is Peter. But there is something deeper than a designation, something deeper than a named successor. The Gospel of Thomas contains a second revelation about leadership and knowledge that goes further than Logion 12, and names something the institution could never organize, never transmit, and never survive. Logion 12 names James as the one to follow after Jesus was gone. Logion 13 reveals what none of them could follow, a level of understanding so far beyond the institutional hierarchy that the man who reached it said sharing even one fragment of it would cause the earth itself to respond with fire. Jesus turned to his disciples and posed a direct challenge. He said, "Compare me to something. Tell me what I am like." 3 men answered, and the answer each man gave revealed exactly where he stood. Simon Peter spoke first. He said, You are like a just angel, a just angel. That is a reverent answer. It places Jesus in the category of divine messengers, holy and pure, sent from above. Peter was reaching for the highest category his religious tradition made available, and his tradition gave him the angel. But an angel is still a created being. An angel is still a messenger dispatched from somewhere by something above it. A just angel still operates within a cosmology that human beings can name and map. And Jesus didn't affirm the answer. He moved on. Matthew spoke next. He said, "You are like a wise philosopher." A wise philosopher. That is also a reverent answer. It places Jesus in the tradition of Greek wisdom, a teacher of universal truths whose insight transcends ordinary understanding. Matthew was reaching for the highest category his philosophical framework made available, and his framework gave him the philosopher. But a philosopher is still a human being, however wise. A philosopher still has teachers. A philosopher still owes a debt to a tradition. A philosopher still stands inside a system of knowledge that someone else built, and Jesus didn't affirm this answer either. He moved on. Then Thomas spoke, and Thomas said, "Teacher, my mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like." Thomas did not give a category. He did not reach for a comparison. He did not search his tradition or his philosophical framework and produce an analogy. He said, "Whatever you are, I cannot name it. Whatever you are, human language does not have a container for it. I do not have a category for what I am looking at." And that, according to the Gospel of Thomas, was the right answer. Because here is what Jesus said in response. He said, "I am not your teacher. Because you have drunk, you have become intoxicated from the bubbling spring that I have tended." Read that carefully. To Peter, Jesus remains the teacher above the student. To Matthew, Jesus remains the teacher above the student. To Thomas, he says something entirely different. He says, "I am no longer your teacher. You have drunk from the same source I tend. You have moved from student to something else entirely, from below to beside, from recipient to participant." Peter and Matthew received instruction. Thomas received transformation. That distinction is the heart of what the Gospel of Thomas is. It is not a text about following the right leader. It is not a text about belonging to the right institution or having the correct doctrine confirmed by the correct authority. It is a text about the capacity to drink from the spring. And Peter's answer showed he hadn't drunk. Matthew's answer showed he hadn't drunk. Thomas's answer, the answer that refused every category, showed that he had. The refusal to name was itself the proof of comprehension. And Jesus recognized it. And then Jesus took Thomas aside, alone, away from Peter, away from Matthew, away from all the others. And he spoke 3 things to Thomas, 3 words, 3 sayings, 3 revelations. The text does not tell us which. The Gospel of Thomas does not record them. Thomas came back to the group. The disciples were waiting, and they asked him, "What did Jesus say to you?" Thomas answered, "If I tell you one of the things he said to me, you will pick up rocks and stone me, and fire will come from the rocks and consume you." 1. He says, if I tell you 1, not all 3. 1. And when that one thing passes from his mouth to their ears, they will not just be overwhelmed, they will pick up rocks. And the fire will not descend from heaven. It will rise from the ground, from the rocks themselves. This is not the language of a teaching that is difficult to understand. This is not the language of a doctrine that requires preparation before it can be received. This is a claim about the intrinsic nature of what Jesus gave Thomas. The knowledge itself cannot be transmitted to a mind that has not already drunk from the same spring. Transmitting it to a mind that has not would not confuse. It would destroy. The institution that built itself on Peter's public confession had no mechanism to receive what Thomas was protecting, not because anyone forbade it, because the institution lacked the capacity. But here is what's fascinating. This was not preserved only in the Gospel of Thomas. The Acts of Thomas, a Syriac text composed around 200 AD, preserves a prayer in which Thomas addresses Jesus directly. He says, "You told me 3 words with which I am inflamed, but which I cannot communicate to others." 2 texts, different centuries, different languages, different communities of origin, and the same secret, the same 3 words, the same fire, the same absolute inability to share. Neither text tells you what the 3 words were. Neither text offers even a suggestion of their content. The mystery is sealed, which means what survived across 1,800 years is not the knowledge Thomas received. What survived is the shape of the space that knowledge left behind. Thomas carried something into his life and his mission that the institutional church could never contain, because no institution can contain a thing the mind must first be transformed to hold. Now return to the beginning of the Gospel of Thomas itself. Its prologue does not say, "These are the sayings Matthew collected." It does not say, "These are the sayings Peter preserved." According to the opening of the Gospel of Thomas as preserved in Nag Hammadi Codex II, the text begins, "These are the secret sayings that the living Jesus spoke, and Didymos Judas Thomas recorded." Thomas is not simply a recipient. He is the archivist. The man who alone received the private revelation was also the man given the responsibility of preserving everything Jesus said. Not Matthew, who compared Jesus to a philosopher. Not Peter, who compared Jesus to an angel. Thomas, who could not find words for what he was looking at. That is not a coincidence. The one who knows the depth of something is the only one equipped to preserve it accurately. You do not make the archivist the person with the most complete knowledge. You make the person with the most complete knowledge the archivist, and the promise attached to understanding what Thomas preserved. Logion 1, the very first saying in the collection, placed at the beginning before all 114. Whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Not whoever follows the right leader. Not whoever submits to the right authority. Whoever finds the interpretation. The entire text Thomas recorded is a key, and the man given the key to the key, the man who alone received the words beneath the words, was Thomas. We are living in days when these truths are clawing their way back to the surface. But most still walk in the version of Christianity that was handed to them, filtered through 700 years of institutional decisions that chose Peter over James, buried the Gospel of Thomas, and made it impossible to ask what Thomas received in private. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you do not miss a single revelation. And tell me in the comments, what do you think those 3 words were? I am fascinated to know how much true seekers of truth like you already sense, because that mystery is the question the Church never wanted you to ask. Now you understand what the institution was afraid of. Not a strange mystical text from the fringes of a forgotten tradition. Not a forgery invented by enemies of Christianity, trying to undermine the faith from the outside. The institution was afraid of something much more specific than that. It was afraid of a text that named someone else, and a text that revealed a level of knowing that its entire hierarchy was structurally unable to receive. Start with Logion 12. If Jesus designated James, not Peter, as the one the disciples should follow after his departure, then the foundation of Petrine primacy does not collapse because of a rival theology. It collapses because of a competing testimony. Matthew 16:18 records one conversation, the Gospel of Thomas records another. If both are early, and if both reflect real traditions, then the question of who Jesus actually designated is no longer settled. It becomes contested, and the institution that built every layer of its authority on the settled answer cannot survive the question being reopened. That is why Logion 12 was dangerous. Not because it contradicted Matthew, but because it turned Matthew's account into one tradition among two. And the papacy cannot be built on one tradition among two. Now add Logion 13. Logion 13 presents a different and more fundamental threat. Peter's answer was inadequate. Matthew's answer was inadequate. Thomas alone received the transformation that elevated him from student to participant. And then Thomas alone received 3 words, too dangerous to share. What does that mean for a church built on apostolic succession? What does it mean for an institution whose entire claim to authority rests on the idea that Jesus transmitted his teaching publicly and completely to the 12, who then transmitted it to the bishops, who transmitted it to the priests? It means there is a level of knowing that bypassed the chain entirely, a private transmission the chain never received, a category of spiritual knowledge that the institutional structure of Christianity doesn't contain and cannot access. According to Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in his Against Heresies around 180 AD, the doctrine of apostolic succession was specifically designed to prevent this claim. In the 3rd volume, he laid out the argument that the unbroken chain of laying on of hands from the 12 apostles to the bishops was the only legitimate guarantee of true teaching. He deployed this doctrine directly against Gnostic communities who claimed access to private transmissions, secret revelations, teachings given to one person alone that the official chain had not received. And then along came a gospel that said, Jesus took one man aside privately and gave him knowledge so explosive that sharing even a single piece of it would cause the listeners to destroy the messenger and the earth itself to respond with fire. But here is what's crucial. This is not a conflict the institutional church resolved only by arguing. It resolved it by suppressing. Around 180 AD, in his catalogue of texts used by communities he intended to eliminate, Irenaeus named the Gospel of Thomas and cited it as evidence of deviance among the followers of a teacher named Marcus. He was not inviting a dialogue. He was not engaging the text on its own terms. He was marking it. The citation of a document in Irenaeus is a death warrant for that document's institutional future. The church did not debate the Gospel of Thomas. It categorized the people using it as communities to be condemned. And James did not escape the same process. James the Just led the Jerusalem church. Paul recorded it in his letters. Josephus documented his execution. Eusebius preserved accounts of his character and his authority. And yet, in the canonical Gospels, the 4 texts that became the authorized narrative, James, the brother of Jesus, does not appear in the lists of the 12. His private resurrection appearance is a single verse in 1 Corinthians. His ruling at the Jerusalem Council is framed as part of a broader consensus. His death is recorded by a Roman Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience, not by any text the church sanctioned. The institutional narrative did not erase James outright. That would have been too visible, too obvious, too easy to detect. It marginalized him. The evidence is there. The verse is there. The council scene is there. The record of his execution is there. But none of it became the center. None of it became the foundation. None of it became the story the institution asked its congregations to understand. The document that explicitly named him as the designated successor remained buried in a jar, and the canonical texts that quietly confirmed his authority remained at the edges of a record whose center pointed somewhere else. That is how you suppress a truth without erasing it. You keep the evidence. You just make sure no one is taught to see it. And then, in 367 AD, the process reached its formal conclusion. In that year, Athanasius, the Bishop of Alexandria, and the most influential theological voice in the Christian East, issued his 39th festal letter, the annual Easter circular sent to all the churches under his authority. And in that letter, he listed exactly the books that constituted the New Testament, 27 books, the same 27 in your Bible today. And his instruction to the churches about everything outside that list was precise. These are the springs of salvation. Let no one add to them, nor take away from them anything. The Gospel of Thomas was not on the list, not a mention of it, not even a note that it existed. It was not excluded with an explanation or a theological argument. It was excluded with silence. Now here is what happened to the communities that had been preserving the texts Athanasius excluded. Most obeyed. The Pachomian monks at the monastery of Chenoboskion, near Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, had been among the preservers. After Athanasius's letter arrived, the institutional pressure to destroy the texts they held was real, and it was official. Destruction was the expected response. But they did not destroy them. They sealed them instead. 13 codices, wrapped in leather, placed inside a sealed earthenware jar, carried to the base of the Jabal al-Tarif cliff, and buried in the ground. Not burned, not dismembered, not thrown into the current of the Nile. Buried. And that choice, to bury rather than burn, tells you something about what the monks believed they were holding. You do not bury what you hate. You destroy what you hate. You bury what you cannot bring yourself to destroy. Which means that on some level, the men who carried those codices to that cliff understood that what they were sealing into the earth was not dangerous to the divine. It was dangerous to the institution. And they understood that those were not the same thing. The suppression did not erase the Gospel of Thomas. It preserved it. The bone-dry desert of Upper Egypt does not rot papyrus. It does not degrade ink. It does not allow the slow damage that would have found these texts in any library, any archive, any collection exposed to the moisture and light of the inhabited world. The institution spent 700 years suppressing a document, and the desert spent 600 of those years keeping it in perfect condition. In December 1945, a farmer's mattock struck a jar, and the text returned. You uncovered the text the institutional church fought for 1,100 years to suppress, not because it was false, not because it was a forgery assembled by enemies of the faith, but because it contained an answer to the one question the institution needed to stay settled. Who leads? And the answer it contained was not the answer the institution had given you. You learned that when the disciples came to Jesus and asked him directly, "We know that you will depart from us. Who is it who will be great over us?" He gave them a name, and the name was James. James the righteous, James the just, James the brother of Jesus, whose name does not appear in the canonical lists of the 12, the man Paul called an apostle in Galatians, the man the risen Christ appeared to privately in 1 Corinthians before appearing to the apostles as a group, the man who issued the ruling at the Jerusalem Council in Acts 15. The man Peter withdrew from table fellowship to avoid displeasing in Galatians 2. The man Josephus recorded the city of Jerusalem mourning when Ananus had him executed in 62 AD. The man Eusebius recorded as the first bishop of Jerusalem, named by Jesus himself. You discovered that the canonical record, in documents that were never buried and never suppressed, quietly tells the same story the Gospel of Thomas tells. Not loudly, not at the center, at the edges. In single verses and single scenes that the institution kept but never built its foundations on, that it preserved in the texts, but never delivered from the pulpit. You witnessed what happened to the man who went deeper than James, Thomas, the man who couldn't give Jesus a category, who said, "My mouth is utterly unable to say what you are like," and who was told in return that he was no longer a student, but a participant, no longer receiving from the spring, but drinking from it alongside the one who tended it. 3 words in private, a lifetime of silence, 2 ancient texts from different centuries confirming the same impossible secret and the same absolute inability to share it. You saw that the evidence for James was not only in the Gospel of Thomas, it was in Paul's own letters, written before the Gospels existed. It was in the book of Acts, in the scene at the Jerusalem Council, where James speaks last and his word is the verdict. It was in Josephus, a Roman Jewish historian writing for a Roman audience with no reason to make James significant. Every independent source, without coordination and without institutional motivation, pointed to the same person. The documents agreed. What they did not agree on was Peter. You understood that the suppression was not accidental. Irenaeus of Lyon named the communities using the Gospel of Thomas in 180 AD. Athanasius of Alexandria excluded it from the New Testament canon in 367 AD, and the monks who preserved it buried it in a sealed jar in the desert rather than burn it, because even they could not destroy what Jesus had said. The desert kept it in perfect condition for 1,600 years. And in December 1945, a farmer's mattock struck the jar, and the text came back. Now here is what the Gospel of Thomas is actually telling you. It is not telling you to replace Peter with James. It is not asking you to discard your faith or abandon the tradition you were raised in. It is doing something more disturbing than either of those things. It is telling you that the question itself, who will be great over us, the question of institutional hierarchy, of succession, of appointed leadership, was answered by Jesus in one way in the documents that survived, and in a different way in the document that was buried. And the buried answer named a man who was never placed in the institutional structure. And the even deeper answer given to Thomas was so far outside any institutional structure that Thomas refused to speak even one word of it. What does that tell you about the structure? It tells you that what survived was not the complete transmission. It tells you that when the men who controlled the canon made their choices, those choices were not theologically neutral. They protected one answer while sealing the other in a jar in the desert. The sealed answer, named James, the answer given only to Thomas, bypassed institutional transmission entirely, because what Thomas received could not travel through a chain of ordained hands. It required the spring, and the institution had not drunk from it. It tells you that what survived was not the whole truth. It tells you that there were 2 conversations, and you were given one of them. It tells you that the gap you may have felt in the version of Christianity you received was real, that the thing that seemed missing was actually missing, because it was in a jar. And now it is not. It is not coincidence that you are watching this now, The Greek fragments of the Gospel of Thomas were discovered by archaeologists in 1897 and 1903 in the ruins of Oxyrhynchus. They sat in academic boxes for nearly 50 years because nobody could identify where they had come from or what text they belonged to. Not until December 1945 did the identification become possible. These truths did not return to the world until the exact moment the world was ready to receive them. The full text waited in sealed clay for 16 centuries, and it is in your hands now, not because of the institution that buried it. In spite of it, the truth always finds the hands that were ready to hold it. You are those hands, and this is that moment. Subscribe to this channel and activate the notification bell so you do not miss a single revelation. And if this video changed how you understand the question of who leads and who follows in the early church, share it with someone who still believes the story ended at Matthew 16:18. Because what we uncovered together in this video does not erase what was written in Matthew. It completes it. It gives you the conversation that Matthew did not record. It fills the gap the institution spent 17 centuries making sure you never noticed was there. In the next video, we go deeper into the Gospel of Thomas, to a saying so radical that when Jesus spoke it, the disciples demanded he stop. What he said is the reason the institutional church fought harder to suppress Thomas than any other gospel in the ancient world. Subscribe and be here for that revelation. Caesarea Philippi, a rock, a set of keys, and a man named Peter. That is what was taught. That is what 2,000 years of institutional Christianity was built on. One conversation, one sentence, one man. But in Logion 12 of the Gospel of Thomas, buried in the Egyptian desert for 16 centuries, Jesus answers a different question. The question the disciples actually asked out loud. The question no institution wanted you to know they had asked. Who comes next? And his answer was James. James the righteous, for whose sake heaven and earth came into being. And to Thomas alone he whispered something that even James could not